Hello.
Howdy.
Hi, all.
Hey.
How's everyone? Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Happy first Composite Schemas working group meeting. It's exciting.
Yeah.
How are you doing, Benji?
Yeah, not too bad. My cat wants to be involved.
It's a fun subject. So yeah, I don't blame your cat.
How's everyone else doing?
Doing well.
Excellent.
Just back
That's
from
what I like to
vacation,
hear.
so that's always fun.
Lovely. Have a good break.
Yeah, ready for another one. It's always the way it works. Yeah.
Vacation from vacation.
Yeah, that's it. Exactly. Multiple young children running around. Yes, definitely needed.
Hey, everybody.
Hello, hello.
Hey, hello.
Howdy.
Just going to give it another minute or two for the participants list to settle.
Hey all.
Hey, Frederick.
Hey everyone, sorry for the slight delay there. My cat wasn't apparently getting enough attention, so decided to be sick. Thanks for that. Right, let's get started. Hello everyone, and welcome to the inaugural meeting of the Graphql Composite Schemas Working Group. This working group is a subcommittee of the Graphql Specification Working Group with the aim of building a likely separate specification that covers many of the shared concerns when building a GraphQL schema as a composite of other GraphQL schemas. To join this meeting, you must have agreed to the spec membership agreement, the participation and contribution guidelines, and the code of conduct. Links to all of those are in the agenda file. If you've not signed the agreement, you shouldn't participate in the meeting. If your name is not on the agenda, please do send a pull request now. Do we have any volunteers for taking notes? It'd be ideal to have 2 or 3 people doing so. Yep, Tim, fantastic.
I'm happy to do so.
Thank you, Bobby. If anyone else wants to, please just start contributing to the notes. Thank you. I'd like to remind you that this meeting is being recorded and will be published onto YouTube for the public to see, so don't share any company secrets here. This working group was created because there are so many different solutions to the problem of combining multiple GraphQL schemas into a single GraphQL schema. Though many of those solutions work in different ways and solve slightly different problems, there are likely quite a few different ways. There are common concerns that a specification of which would benefit all of us. I should note that this working group is not here to build a full specification for the one and only true way to combine multiple schemas together. Instead, it's here for us to build a solid foundation that all the different solutions can build upon. So let's quickly review the agenda. First up, I've allowed about a minute each for everyone to introduce themselves, their companies, and what has motivated them to join this working group. After that, I think the main discussion will be around identifying the common concerns when we're building a composite schema. I don't think that we're going to dig too deeply into any of those specific concerns this meeting. Those will probably be the topic of future meetings. Is there anything that anyone else feels should be on the agenda? Fantastic. On to introductions. So since this is our first meeting, our main aim is to figure out what outcomes we want out of this working group. As such, if you could each take a minute to introduce yourself, your company, perhaps mention what composite schema technologies you're currently using, if any, and what you hope to get out of this working group. We'll do this in the order of the attendees in the agenda. I did try and group various of the companies together, but I know there's been some late additions. I guess I'll get us started. Hi, everyone. I'm Benji. I run Graphql, a community-funded open source tooling company focused on GraphQL, Node.js, and Postgres. For me, one of the great things about GraphQL is the shared specification, which has enabled the development of all this shared tooling that we know and love so much. I noticed as more and more solutions to the composite schemas problem were coming out that I started to feel a bit worried that we're losing this benefit, that as things started to diverge more, the tooling, it was harder to be compatible with all these different solutions. So what I would like to see is for it to be straightforward for people to build schemas and tooling that are broadly compatible with all of these different approaches. Next up, I think, is Raphael. Who doesn't seem to be here. So, Dotan.
Hi everyone, I'm Dotan. I'm here representing the guild. Also, we have a few more guild members here. I'm happy that this is happening. We see a lot of different solutions, different ideas, and I'm happy that we have one place for all of us to collaborate and think of how we can make GraphQL better. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Next is Camille, he's not here. Also Arda is not here. And the next is Sahaj.
Hello everyone, I'm Sahaj and I work at the guild, also help maintain GraphQL.js and a couple other things. Pretty excited to be here and get more into composite schemas. I do like type merging and schema stitching. So having a standard around like how you can actually stitch these schemas would be a great idea, I think. Yep.
Hi, my name is Yakov. I actually have a full-time job out of tech, but I got into open source development actually mainly through stitching, schema stitching, picking up the GraphQL tools project on a work-related side project. And then I fell in love with GraphQL and still thinking about ways in which GraphQL can actually integrate with GraphQL. It integrates with a lot of other data sources, but it's kind of hard to compose different GraphQL schemas. And so glad to be here and to learn from everyone's approaches. And thanks, Benji and everyone else.
Hey everyone, I'm Tim, CTO and founder of Stellate. We have been so far focusing on GraphQL caching, and with our recent change in vision, we also want to connect different schemas, and still we're new in the topic, so I'm happy to learn a lot today and curious to what we come up with. Yeah.
And hi everyone, I'm Matteo. I'm currently focusing on open source, not working for any company, but sooner rather than later that will happen. I am here because I represent. Sorry for the noise. I'm currently here because I am the author of the Mercurius library. We implement the Apollo Federation protocol, and I'm really, we faced a bunch of challenges when doing things, And I'm here to share what we learned, but also to collaborate on a spec independent, on a specification or anything that is completely unrelated from that is shared and generic and not covered by patents or other threats that might be implicit on the situation. So yeah, that's me.
I think Michael is not here.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, Michael.
Next is
Okay,
probably
I'll go. Hey everyone, I'm Nathan. I'm an engineer for a startup called First Dollar out of Austin, Texas. I'm here because I've run into this problem quite a bit at a handful of different companies, and we've tried like our own internal solutions back in 2017, 2018. Eventually GraphQL modules came out, so we've been using that quite a bit, and then done some exploration into Apollo Federation too. So yeah, excited to see what comes out of this. I think next is Stefano.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Stefano. I work for American Express, and I'm really interested into this group because we do a lot of things with GraphQL. We are currently using a standard GraphQL tool for not even stitching together and putting together multiple schema files, and it's something good. It can scale. Federation can be an opportunity, but yeah, I'm really interested in trying to come out with a sort of good best practices and the standards for tooling, because otherwise, well, we can easily end into 5 different libraries doing 5 different things, all are regulated, and it's going to be quite a mess, frankly. Who's next?
Hi, I'm Nick. I'm here representing Amazon and AWS AppSync. I'm interested in, looking at the different approaches out there and seeing if we can come up with an independent standard, because I think it'll be best for customers. Since I've been involved with AppSync, we've gotten a lot of requests about how we could support composite schemas in AppSync, and we're looking at that this year.
Hi, my name is Predrag. I'm the maintainer of 2 libraries, GraphQL Compiler and Trustful, and I've been working on Federation-related things since around 2019-ish at a company called Kensho. We use GraphQL probably very differently than almost everyone else here. We use it to query in a database-style way, so kind of more akin to SQL. We don't really use it to drive, Relay or React. So the outputs that these libraries output is differently structured, but we've still been the beneficiaries of the awesome tools that are in the GraphQL ecosystem. And I'm here to figure out how we can do Federation better and smooth over some of the issues that we've found so far, but also just learn from what everyone else has figured out, and hopefully we can come up with something that's going to be awesome for everyone. So thank you so much to everyone that organized this. I'm excited to be here.
Hey, it's Derek from Apollo here. Since I'm working in Federation, I'm kind of curious whether we can come up with something common for all the specifications to work together. So I think Caleb is next.
Thanks. Hi, my name's Caleb. I'm here representing, I work at Meta. I'm interested in this group because we've recently had a push to unify how we do schema stitching, because we have different strategies on both the client and server side. So looking to unify that and hear about what other strategies are being used out there.
Hi,
no, sorry, go ahead.
Hey, I'm Steven. I work at Netflix. So we have found a need to be able to stitch or federate or something, and we're trying to going down the road of doing our own thing, and then Apollo's Federation spec came along, and I feel like it did fill in some pieces that are missing from GraphQL spec, and it was the closest thing to a spec at the time that that existed. But it's felt like it would be great to move some of these concepts into the GraphQL specs. I'm really excited to see this.
I think Agata isn't here, so we should go to Roman then. Or should we switch Roman and go to Bobby from Steps In?
Hello.
I think he's just muted.
Hello. Yeah, sorry, usual mistake. My name is Roman. I work at Microsoft, and my main motivation here is actually my previous experience with the big systems, big not in the term of number of records, number of users, but big in the complexity of schemas and big banking ERP systems. Usually we talk about 5,000 tables in the database and up, like SAP is 45,000 tables. And as excited as I was when I was introduced to GraphQL and all of its advantages and so on, it was clear for me from the beginning that it won't quite work on the bigger scale in terms of number of entities. And probably many of you have your own stories with big data models. So I'm really interested to be here and to see how we can advance it and to make it scalable. Thank you.
Yeah, Bobby Cochran from Steps In. I'm here because Federation is definitely what we are building the engine around. And one of the things Steps In was very interested in when it started was making it easier to program APIs, and the GraphQL spec and having it standard is very critical and important for us. So having the Federation concepts standardized and pulling together the various approaches is important to work in the ecosystem together.
I'm Jason. I'm Jason Webb. I'm from Intuit, and one of the things that we're excited about this collaboration to get going. I know it's something that we've struggled with as we've tried to implement a graph across a lot of services. We've solved this problem internally 2 different ways, and then we've also used Apollo Federation to try to solve this problem. And just the variability in the number of ways you can do it, it leads to a lot of turn in like trying to roll it out across a big enterprise. So having something that's a little bit more standardized and sort of that, and also through some open governance will be really awesome.
Hey everyone, I'm John Starich. I work on the IBM Cloud Kubernetes Service APIs. So my motivation for joining is our APIs are evolving into a more complex mesh of different services. Composite schemas and its various forms do provide lots of important solutions for us. So we're currently looking at adopting a relay style GraphQL federation, but it's very much in progress. So it's the perfect time for my team and probably many other teams at IBM to work on a shared standard. Separately and similarly to many others, I'm also very interested in this problem, making GraphQL better for everyone. And composite schemas are a very interesting problem to me personally.
Hi, my name is Ivan. I'm involved, I think like since 2017 with different foundation projects, mainly like around spec and reference implementation. I work at Apollo. I would say my interest is helping with low-level mechanisms and see like how it can fit with what I'm working inside Apollo, like share metadata for introspection or other similar concerns. I think about the whole strategy or roadmap or picture from Paul. Martin is a better person to talk, so I will pass to him. You're on mute, Martin.
Yeah, I'm Martin. I work at Apollo. I was part of the team that designed Apollo Federation, and I've been sort of involved in the different parts of our platform since. I'm very interested to hear more about sort of the problems people are encountering and the different approaches they've taken. I'm hoping there are sort of common concerns that we can address either within the GraphQL spec. Like I'm thinking of things like document level directives, for instance, or the exposing metadata. I think those are probably spec concerns. There may also be concerns that sort of don't belong in the core GraphQL spec, but that we can sort of write separate specs around. So I think there's probably plenty of opportunity to sort of discuss what we're trying to do and what is common about the approaches we're taking. So I'm yeah, looking forward to hearing more from people.
Awesome. Yeah, Ivan and Derek and Martijn have covered a lot of the things I was going to say, but I'm Hugh. So I'm just here to hang out, really, be part of this fun conversation. No, seriously, though, I'm with Benji in this one. I honestly think that the GraphQL specification is one of the greatest things about GraphQL as well. And I'm really excited to see a lot of us come together and work on standardizing or coming up with shared opinions and thoughts and ideas that we can kind of put forward in a specification. I think that's super critical to the health of the ecosystem in the community as we've seen it grow. So very excited about all this to develop further. And yeah, very excited to see what Apollo can do here to help out with the working group and where things go with this initiative. So thanks for having me.
I am Jens, the founder of Wundergraph. First of all, I want to thank Benji for starting this initiative. It was long due, so it's really nice. We start the discussion here. I'm also happy to see so many familiar faces. What we do at Wundergraph is that we introspect a whole bunch of services that doesn't have to be GraphQL, it could be anything. And we try to automatically stitch it together so that as a developer, you can talk to any system in your organization or even beyond your organization, can just use one single language, one single client, makes it a whole lot easier to talk to all things that you want access to. And for example, one of the issues we very early on ran into that if you combine multiple schemas, then you run into naming collisions very easily because two schemas have very likely a user or something. So we needed to figure out a way how to solve that problem. We introduced API namespacing, which is just prefixing stuff because the API spec or the GraphQL spec has no concept of namespacing. So I'm hoping that our discussions here will, for example, lead to a proper solution that is better than just prefixing stuff. And yeah, maybe we can also figure out other things. And I really like the idea of Benji not to come up with a spec, but rather maybe we can extend the existing specification in a way that you can compose schemas easily and everybody can figure out what is the best way to leverage like the extended language that the spec could offer to help merging stuff, you know, like, for example, you have stuff like schema.org, and when you have a user, you could say, okay, this is a user, but it's actually a user of some type in schema.org. So it's not just some user, but another company that tries to connect to the schema could understand what kind of user this actually is. So yeah, that's my motivation. I hope we find better ways of stitching and federating and however you want to call it.
Yeah, hi, my name is Dustin from Wundergraph. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing implementation, working on the implementation specification It is truly open source and free to use for everyone. And that's great tooling is building around of that. And yes. Thanks.
Hi everyone, I'm Johnny. So I'm an engineer at Unity. And yeah, basically my interest here is just seeing the power of the likes of things like open telemetry and just kind of collaborating and sharing ideas to kind of sort of converge on, yeah, basically just a nice way of doing things that everyone kind of agrees on, and also, you know, sort of takes advantage of the power of GraphQL already. So yes, I'm here to kind of, well, from that regard, and then also just to provide experience from using it at Unity. So we use the Mercurius server, so I can provide experience from that point of view as well. So yeah, I'm happy to meet you all and really looking forward to it.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. Was there anyone that didn't get a chance to be introduced, maybe joined later?
Yeah, my name wasn't on the list, but I applied for the other one. So anyways, I'm Lauren. I'm working at the Guild, and at the Guild, we're building like a schema registry and stuff like this, and we want to support all different kinds of SDL-based schema type merging. And while I did some research on that, I at some point realized that existing solutions are fairly limited. Like you can't have redundancy in types, and types can be owned by many servers and stuff like that. A field can really exist on different schemas and then be merged, and then the gateway could decide from which service or subschema he wants to resolve that field and stuff like that. So I'm curious to see what other people think about these things, and yeah, maybe in the end come up with a shared spec for everyone. Thank you.
Hi, also I PR'd late as usual. I'm Uli from the Guild. I'm really excited that this is happening. Benji, thank you so much for making this happen. I think just by the number of people that are joining here, we can see how exciting this whole thing is and how valuable it can be. I think for me, just even having like a dictionary of what's actually happening there and a name for each thing, like a clear name for each thing, would be extremely valuable. Like everyone, I think, is named, like we see almost every day, we work with people that are using probably most of the solutions that we're mentioning here. Like we're working daily with most of them. And the way that people are even just pronouncing the names of what they want to do varies so much. So I think even just like having like a clear wording for things would help tremendously. And just having like a clear separation of what problems we're actually solving and who is solving what and how, just the landscape would be extremely, extremely valuable. So I'm really excited to be part of it, and I'm really excited to share everything we're doing. And yeah, thanks for everything, for making it happen.
Anyone else? I think that's everyone now. Okay, fantastic. Thanks, everyone. That was really great. I've written down a few of we've got some great notes that have been taken, but I've written down a few of the words. There seems to be desire for like a shared or generic spec of some of these things, to the desire for more consistency, for better compatibility, for better scalability, especially when dealing with a lot of different entities in your graph. There's concerns that there are currently too many ways to do it. There's a desire for open governance, for management of metadata, for dealing with naming collisions, for having shared definitions, I think was of types. I didn't actually write down of what, and shared terminology and language, as Yuri just mentioned. So quite a lot of different problems there. that I think we all mostly agree on various of these. I suspect that the Venn diagram is quite overlapping of all of those. So that's great. Thank you for sharing that. So I guess now what we should do is move on to figuring out a bit more about some of these common concerns. So I think we can keep this fairly open. I'm afraid I haven't kept up with the chat, but do use the chat. It would be a great place to suggest a topic and see if we can build up some momentum behind that topic and then bring it to the voice chat. But in the meantime, is there something that anyone would particularly like to kick us off with?
I think if we'll start with just the understanding, like the terminology and the naming of each feature or idea or concept, it would make it easier later to create like more topics and more things to discuss on, and will help us to clarify what we're actually trying to do here.
Yeah, that sounds great. What terminology do people find that they're using currently? We've got representatives here from quite a number of the different technologies that are in use. So maybe some of you that are project leaders of those projects, maybe you would be in a good place to mention a few of the terms that you use, and we can see if we can find some commonality there.
Can I probably drop a few words? So maybe some good way to start is to look at some really troubled scenarios of today and look at the groups of users, clients, whatever, developers affected. For example, if you try to use let's say clients I'm trying to use GitHub API and trying to look at their schema. It turns out it's like 500,000 lines of code, 500,000 lines, and it's actually really hard and almost inhumane to make something out of this mess. So, for example, for the end users, for the clients, it's important that the schema is not exactly stitched together, but can be downloaded in pieces, right, in modules. And probably Predrag also mentioned the scenario when they had the downloading the introspection query in Graphql took like 1 minute. It was like 700 megabyte size. So this applies not only to the schema file, but also introspection query. So it can be done kind of, you could explore it in smaller pieces, maybe modules or separate files or whatever we would call it. So I think one important scenario is keep in mind, we do not want always merge schema into one big thing, and maybe try to learn how to make it work even when the schema and the kind of project remains in multiple pieces. Basically, this is the first scenario. The second scenario on the server side, yes, let's say you have a huge schema. It means a huge project, multiple teams. So one scenario is that you have one server and exposing one GraphQL API, and you just have multiple teams who want to work independently, not to have any contention on a central GraphQL schema file or whatever artifact is there, and having some system stitching it all together into one API. But basically, it's not Apollo Federation kind of scenario when at runtime a single front-end server stitches multiple GraphQL servers, backend GraphQL servers together, you actually have monolith on one server, but just there is no problem stitching and like querying objects from different server. I think you understand what I mean. But basically, just purely syntactic, semantic ways in GraphQL spec allowing to work with schema living in multiple files on the server. And I think the third scenario is Apollo-like federation, when you have multiple GraphQL servers and you want to merge them at runtime dynamically to look like one. And all the splits, all the parts of the original schemas, they are kind of lost for the front-end user. So, and also I want to point out one kind of elephant in the room in these discussions. Remember that we have this problem of mutations, that they should appear only at the top level, and they will actually represent kind of a challenge if you can define types in different modules and different places, and then the type contains all its internals. Let's say you can explore it deep when querying it. When doing mutation, you have to introduce mutation as an element at the very top level, and at the end, the mutation type should merge all the mutation from different sub-schemas, some elements. I think this is kind of a challenging factor. So unless we do something about nested mutations or whatever they call, they were already kind of attempts to do them more structural or more, let's say, tree-like or hierarchical, and that would help. I just wanted to point out that this elephant in the room as well. That's all for me. I forgot, with the big schemas, sorry. With the big schemas, of course, come up the namespacing problem. No matter how we do it in the back end and how we merge them, namespacing is kind of hence everything. Thank you. Now I'm done. Sorry.
Just for purposes of scope, I would recommend that we try to figure out what works for the reads side first, and then think about mutations, subscriptions, live queries, the sort of longer tail. At least in my experience, there's plenty of complexity on just the read side, and if we bring mutations and subscriptions and all the other things into scope immediately, then we risk sort of doing a lot of meetings and not getting anything done.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yuri, you've had your hand up for a while.
Thanks. I'll try to maybe, I don't know, like organize it from everything we're seeing and maybe, I don't know, just the landscape. So I think basically we have how I see it currently is that we have the core components of this is that we have schemas, let's call them, I don't know, you know, we can, I don't want to call them servers for a reason, but let's say executable schemas that are being created separately. So we have those that, let's say, these can conform to, these are GraphQL schemas, no matter how they created now. And then we have the extra definition of how do we then turn those into one single schema. Now, sometimes those definitions and those definitions of how can we take those different definitions, configurations of how we take all those different schemas and combine them together, we can express it in many different ways. So, it could be through directives and metadata that lives on these services. It could be as code living on the gateway. It could be as configurations living on the gateway or living anywhere else, written anywhere else. So I think we have I would say we have specific schemas. Then we have definitions of how we merge, like instructions on how we merge them together. Those instructions, we could maybe identify different use cases and what are the instructions that we want to actually say. And maybe later on we can think how we can express those instructions. But this type from that, just as an example, this type from this schema is like going to fit into in this place into the unified schema. The reason I'm not saying servers is that we also have a separation between when are we doing that process? Are those schemas being part of a runtime server that we have no control of? Or are we doing that unification at build time? I think we can come up, whether we're doing this or that, we can come up with the scenarios of how do we merge all those different things and all the different use cases of conflicts between types, conflicts between fields and things like that. And separately, how do we then solve them? So yeah, so I think all those different separate things are candidates for us to standardize upon. Yeah, I don't know if it makes sense.
Can I? My question then, you're talking about these additional instructions on merging, right? Is it like separate file and not exactly GraphQL thing? Because like instruction on merging can be simply an additional import statement, right? We have some root file and a few import statements.
What I don't want is to start with like a specific technical way of expressing it. I think what we would want is basically looking at the scenario, like the theoretical scenario of taking, let's say, an example 2 services or 3 services, schemas, sorry, not services, and how would we want the unified schema to look like? And then what are the primitives we need to express in order to create that unified schema? I don't want to say we're doing it through directives. I don't want, or I don't think I want the initial, it's not to be, we're doing it through directives, we're doing it through import statements or things like that, because I think if we come up with those primitives, basically the primitives of how things, like what we are actually trying to express, we could express this with everything. We could express the same thing with many different solutions. And if we are coming with those primitives, then all those different solutions will be able to actually work together. And you could also be flexible on expressing it or on the services themselves or on the thing that merges all of those together. So I think there's a potential here to come up with those primitives without talking about the actual solution. And then after that, we can also think about, once you have that merged, take specific scenarios. For example, once you have that merged schema, we can maybe talk about the different algorithms to run it. And that also depends on where you run this thing.
Oh,
Yeah, so I'm first of all, I think I'm already gaining a lot from this. So thanks so much. I come at it, in terms of, what a suggestion in terms of how to tackle things first, and might be from like looking at some of the maybe low-level building blocks that might be useful. Because I'm definitely most interested in merging at runtime schemas that you don't even know, sort of don't even control necessarily. That's like sort of my end goal. But I think very valuable in terms of that end goal, and maybe some other different ways of composing, would be some like lower level tools. Like for example, specifically what I think we could really benefit from is a way to within the spec to talk about a group of types or other GraphQL entities, meaning types and / directives together, and make sure that they validate together. And then like taking some of those groups and making sure that they're quote unquote composable. And there are different types of composability, like build time, runtime, and maybe some variations of those, because there's different types of runtime composition. There's the GraphQL tools schema stitching version, which I've been working on, and there's federation, and there's some others that don't allow type merging, and probably others that do. So there's different types, but I think all of them could be boiled down in terms of rules of composability. And just like we have, sort of validation of a GraphQL schema and of GraphQL operations documents, we could also, think about, composability in that sense. Like we have different, pieces of schema, and then we want to compose them in certain ways that require certain rules. So you could specify those certain ways, or we could just come up with a list of rules, and those could be sort of that could be very useful to have that within the spec, as sort of that. And I think that would be helpful in terms of language, like sort of syntax and common ideas and frameworks. And then if we had some actual tools and we could say that this is composable with that, then we could sort of compose things maybe across different organizations even, and that would be very helpful. So that's one set of ideas, like schema, I'm not sure what to call it, schema parts or schema subsets, that might be helpful, and validation built around that. And another thing that, well, actually, let's get some feedback on that first.
Yeah, for my 2 cents, I'm a big fan of composability. I think that's the only way we can get to where we all would like to get, because this is a very complex problem. I would also like to say that I think it's also important that we figure out which things can get in the way of composability. And there was some discussion in the chat around, each service defining dependencies, and that maybe being a sticking point. So I think a valuable thing to get out of this work and this meeting is what sorts of things should we avoid introducing, and what sorts of things should GraphQL as a whole try to avoid introducing that might get in the way of this sort of composability? Because this problem is already hard enough. We don't need to make it even harder on ourselves.
So that's sort of leads in the other building block that I was going to mention is transformation. And again, without speaking about the method of namespacing, there's a lot of conflicts that can be sort of simply avoided, and mergeability and composability that can be sort of eased by introducing a sort of a way of talking about namespacing, whether it's like enums that have different members, and inputs, which is a big problem, or scalars that are differently defined, versus types, with fields with different arguments that exist on different without defaults that exist. So there's a lot of different problems, but coming up with a common language for how to transform existing schemas, and to talk about how we transform them, would solve a lot of those problems. And then I think there are others. There's a whole other class of problems, maybe like within GraphQL, like types. I'm not sure. It sort of hurts my brain a little bit, but we're talking about some new types like one of and other things that I'm not sure exactly. So there's some things that can be solved by namespacing and transforms, and certainly maybe other people can talk about maybe set classes of problems of composability that can't be solved in that way.
Jens, you've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on that. I think there's a new directive for scalars, right? It's something like specified by or similar, right? I think it would also be interesting to discuss something like specified by for interfaces, because think about, you have an interface that defines how a GraphQL server could behave, and you put that interface on the query or mutation type. If you now have a directive with something like specified by, someone could from outside introspect this service and understand, oh, it implements an interface, and that interface, it's not just some random interface that someone came up with, but it's specified somewhere on a URL or something. So that could mean a process could automatically introspect the service and understand its capabilities in an automated way. So you could have something like a geocoder interface, and 3 different service providers can implement the same interface, and now a user is able to talk to these services and knows or understands the contract. I don't know if anybody has a comment on that. Second one, I wanted to ask a question, because one big fear I always have with composing stuff is, did anybody reach any limits in terms of what happens if you put a couple of hundreds of thousands of lines of GraphQL schema into a file? Does the IDE still work? Do you get auto completion, or is there, I don't know, at some point, do we run into the issue of, okay, we compose too much and everything breaks, or do we need new tooling to support these use cases? I don't know.
I've blown up the stack in Python, in Rust, and in a few other environments from parsing schemas that were too large. And I've also blown up Graphql, because turns out a 700 megabyte schema file is not amazing for introspection.
I actually wanted to ask about it, because we have internal discussion in Apollo about introspection versus SDL files. So in your case with like huge schema, do you feel it's like introspection specific issues, or you have the same issues if you use SDL files? So is it like global problem, or just problem of using introspection mechanism for execute? Yeah, interesting. And
so like I mentioned, we use GraphQL rather differently. So our return type is not fully nested. It's essentially an iterator of flattened results. You can ask for nesting inside, but by default, the outermost scope is just kind of like SQL-ish table-like. And our results can be rather large, and our schemas can be rather large, because they're just an introspected database with hundreds of thousands of tables, for example. And the key issue that we ran into is not necessarily specific to introspection, but sort of a more broader expectation in the ecosystem that when you run a GraphQL query, its response is something that you can fit in memory at one time. And that is frequently not the case for us. So our schemas are sort of not reasonable to just shove into the browser all at once. The results of our queries are not reasonable to shove into the browser all at once. So we have a lot of pagination, lazy loading, fetch the first 100 things, return a cursor, and then ask for more when you need them type stuff. Happy to talk more in case this is off topic. Happy to talk later.
Stephen, do go ahead.
Yeah, so it's really interesting to hear all the different use cases that bring people like to the table here, and one of the differences, it seems, is that in some cases you have like you basically you want to build one big schema, but just you want to build it in parts because it's so big. And but in that case, you're often, maybe the parts of it are aware of the other parts and referencing them. And then there's another case where you want to bring together different, subgraphs that are maybe not even aware of each other, that didn't know at the time they were made that they were going to be brought into this composite graph. And so I wonder if it is worth calling out these use cases, and because some solutions are maybe like more amenable to one than the other, but it seems like these are both things that people want to do, and so it's and in general, a good place to start is kind of cataloging our use cases, like what are the reasons we want to composite.
This is actually an interesting point because we started earlier with finding a common language. So I'd like to ask, because if services know each other and you know the people behind those services, I usually call this federation. And if you put something together that doesn't know each other, or it's from another service that you cannot control, I usually call it stitching. So I'd like to ask how everybody else names the stuff, and maybe it makes sense to just figure out a common terminology to name these two concepts.
I use stitching just to refer to the schema stitching package from GraphQL tools. But in my mind, it's a form of runtime composition, like Federation, like Hot Chocolate that does runtime composition from what I understand. But I don't use stitching to mean anything in particular.
Yeah, for me, when I hear federation, I actually think about Apollo Federation, and Apollo Federation for me is a type of doing SDL directive-based schema composition.
Well, I mean, the folks at Apollo are definitely here. When I put there are two different types of runtime composition. I think it's important to note that from Federation is passing around, from what I understand, passing around entities fully through like this dynamically built scalars that accept anything. So that's one approach, and then there could be a more typed approach to runtime composition. But to me, I agree with Lauren that Federation to me just means Apollo Federation, but it's a type of runtime composition.
Yeah, I would say for Apollo Federation, the entity model is pretty essential. That's sort of the core of the approach, not necessarily the way sort of entity representations are passed around, because that's an implementation detail, and there are alternatives to that. But the notion that sort of federating a schema happens at entity boundaries, that's a pretty central concept for us.
Yeah, a thought on just like the runtime versus build time division. It's funny, in a lot of ways I think of like Apollo Federation as a build time composition, because you do like at development time, you're defining your entities, and then the composition happens like deterministically, based on your declared schemas ahead of time. And then it's just at runtime, this is, it's distributing the execution of it, but that's just kind of when it comes to execution, we can also execute it together, in the same box, like on the same server or whatever.
Well, it can be on the same server, but it can also be on different servers. So even though there's some like build time validation and I guess you're right, though, that maybe I would reword as not runtime composition, but maybe remote schema execution. Not sure, but there is a difference there that I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Can I point out to one, I think, kind of important thing? So based on Predrag's information about these huge schemas and troubles with the big models with introspection, right? I want to point out that this is kind of the most visible part of the problem, let's say, and in GraphQL area at all. It concerns the protocol communication of client and servers. And in this case, any improvement in this area to improve working with big schemas for the clients will definitely need some syntactic additions to the GraphQL languages. While there is another part you were just talking about stitching on the server and is it runtime and so on. This is kind of hidden part from the client. It's not on the why, it's kind of what server or servers doing behind the scene there. And I would suggest that this part is actually doesn't necessarily have to be in the GraphQL syntax in any way. Like it's more like about servers and vendors producing their own maybe private standard and using some extra files to communicate and to organize this whole thing. Let's say some kind of manifest from the servers to be able to be stitched together or federated on the server. This is, and what I'm saying is that this file, this information doesn't have to be necessarily embedded into GraphQL language, schema, and so on. It can be an extra XML, JSON, and so on file, and kind of a separate standard. I'm not saying that kind of kicking out these server guys, I'm a server guy, you know, from this discussion, but I would suggest to start with this to focus maybe because it's more related to GraphQL spec, the scenario of clients communicating with the server and trying to discover the schema and work with introspection in some reasonable way and not to be overflown with gigabytes of text and information. And this, because this will much more connected and linked to the GraphQL spec by itself. The server side backend stuff is not so much. It would be good if it can fit there without many additions, but the server side is free to have their own additional conventions and standards. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I would actually argue the other way around, to be honest. I would actually argue that like what you're saying is basically there's like a technical issue for you to like introspect a lot of a big schema. That's a technical issue that, you know, I think it doesn't matter how like it's something that we need to figure it out. I think maybe I'm wrong, but my reading of the intros is actually that people here are more interested in how different schemas are being merged together. And I agree with your point that like maybe it shouldn't be something that's related necessarily to something to add to the SDL. I think it's that's why I said at the beginning, I think let's figure it out what we're trying to express, and then later separately we can express it with maybe directives on SDL, maybe config files, or maybe other things that other people would have an idea on. But I do think a lot of people here are actually interested in like the primitives of how do we take specific separate schemas and turn them into that one big schema that the consumer, I wouldn't say necessarily the client, but the consumer would be able to look at as if it was one schema logically form.
Yeah, I agree with this interpretation. It seems to me that we're discussing two problems here. This working group was set up to solve the problem of taking multiple different schemas and combining them into one larger schema. And separately, Roman has raised the issue of if you have one large schema, no matter how it's produced, whether it be through multiple smaller ones being combined, or whether it be just a big schema. Like my understanding is that Facebook have a massive monolithic schema that is a problem. In that situation, we then have another thing where you might want to break that schema back down again to make it manageable. But as Yuri says, there's effectively a technical problem in that you don't have enough memory to represent this or things like that. In which case, I think that is definitely a problem that needs solving, but I think it is independent from the aims of this working group, which is about taking the many and turning it into the one, rather than taking the one and turning it into the many.
Although if we do get some nice building blocks together, we might be able to reuse them for the same problem, schema parts or schema bits or whatever we want to call it.
Absolutely. So
no, I would say that these are linked together tightly, because if you had logically separated sub-schemas on the server, it makes sense to present it to clients as logically separated pieces, right?
The
so
intent of GraphQL
is
to hide a lot of that from the client. The client shouldn't need to know that you compose this out of like 8 different schemas or 100 different schemas. Very much the GraphQL layer acts as an abstraction. So what you expose as the different subparts of your graph, if you were to split a large schema into modular subpieces, versus how you actually build those subpieces may well be different. And we can see that already in the way that, for example, federation allows you to take a user type that's defined on one place and add fields to it from another place. So the places where those things are defined and which parts of those are modules of the schema are not necessarily the same thing. So I think it is a separate subject. It does definitely overlap, but it's a problem that I think we should aim to solve in a separate conversation. Otherwise, the scope of this is going to get too wide and we're not going to be able to solve it. One thing that I've noticed quite a lot of people have talked about is this concept of whether the schemas know that they're being composed or whether they don't. So, i.e., do you control the schema that is going into this larger schema, and are you building it with that intent in mind? Or have you got this other schema that you want to pull in? Maybe it's made by a smaller team that doesn't really care about the larger schema. Maybe it's actually a completely remote schema. So an example of that I do, for example, is Stripe. Like, they don't actually have a GraphQL schema as far as I know right now, but I will embed Stripe bits into my API when I deal with billing. So there'll be a Stripe invoice and there'll be like a Stripe invoice item and things like that in my GraphQL schema. Similarly, if you're working with, say, the GitHub API, and you might want to represent things like issues from a repository, if you're building like a notifications manager for GitHub, you may want to compose those parts of that other schema. And I see that kind of composition definitely still in scope, but you do not have any control over those schemas. And also, importantly, you don't want to import the whole thing. You want to import like a small subtree of it, perhaps, certain fields, maybe a fragment or something like that. So one of the things that Yuri talked about quite early on was this idea that there's all these different ways of expressing how this field in this schema relates to this ultimate schema that you're looking to build. And that can be expressed through code or through configuration. It can be part of the schema. It can be external to the schema. And I wonder whether these two use cases, the use case where you're building a lot of schemas separately with the intention of smushing them together at the end, or whether you're building this like top level thing and you may not, some of the schemas you build it out of may not know about that. Do they actually need separate solutions, or is it better to try and find a single solution that covers all of them?
My 2 cents is that if we can figure out a way to combine schemas together and compose them together where the schemas themselves don't have to cooperate and know about each other, that would cover the other example as well, but it would also be more difficult to do. So that would be kind of the holy grail from my perspective.
It's a very interesting question. I think I agree that if this is also, I think, part of the reason I think we shouldn't necessarily like talk about how you separate it from how you implement it and where it sits, because there's how those two fields are supposed to be merged, or maybe there's another way of saying it that is more generic, but and then there's who decides on that and in what scenario and when. So like we could agree on like on a way to specify that those two are being merged, and then maybe if you have, and then at that point you could decide if I have the access to the underlying services, I can put it there as a directive. And if not, I can put it in on the consumer or on the thing that merges it. And I have, and then I have this distinguish. And if I have access to the sources of them, I can do it at build time. And if not, I can, validate it in a different way, but validate these rules. But maybe first we can have just the list of rules, and then we can put those rules and then we have the flexibility to put it in different places and to also execute the validations in different times and execute the merging in different times and in different scenarios. And because if we do that, then when we go, let's say, and we say, okay, let's say we have access to the underlying services, then we have a couple of options. We can tell them, hey, you need to use these directives, or maybe just rename your field, just change your schema. So there's a,
Just to add to Uri's point, I can show the federation system that I helped build did exactly the thing that Uri was just saying. There were a number of different databases that exposed themselves via GraphQL schema. There was a separate service that took all of those schemas, combined them together for client purposes, and the actual execution and merging of the results was done entirely client-side. So the client would see the portion of the combined schema that it needed. It would write a query against that. It would send it to this metadata service that would slice it up and tell it how to run the individual different pieces. Those pieces would then get executed against the database without the metadata service being in the loop at all, and the client would combine the results as necessary. And we were very happy with it.
Yeah, I'll add the small thing that's why I wanted to separate this, like not to use gateway and not to use client, but maybe like, let's say the merge schema and the consumer, because first of all, the consumer could be a client, could be another service, could be even like another function that calls the other function. So yeah, and then the merging again could be run anywhere, and we see those. We have probably use cases. We see use cases across the whole spectrum of everything I've just said. Even though for like the classical GraphQL, maybe it sounds a bit insane.
Uri, that sounds to me that's basically in one sense maybe that's what you meant explicitly, but I'll just rephrase. It sounds to me like you're answering Benji's question that we should think of a solution that can be generic enough to work even for a schema that you don't control, because we want to think in terms of just generic solutions. Is that part of what you're saying?
Yeah, you summarized me much better than I did. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess that raises like tons of new challenges of like how you even define the different merging possibilities. But I feel like if we'll crack and find like the ultimate solution for that, then that would be ideal and could be adjusted to all the other existing or non-existing solutions that we have today. Because if you can merge any graphical schema from any source without having the specific metadata or specific hints, then this might be even a more flexible solution.
While we're digesting that, which I agree with also, I just remembered one additional building block that we've encountered in schema stitching that might be helpful. I mean, some of these might be changes to the spec itself, but it gets pretty confusing when trying to relay remote schema errors back to the user. And that's in two senses. One is that sometimes we're not sure whether we want to give the user the knowledge that the error came from a remote schema. We want to make it look like the error, like, there could have been no, that it was all one schema, the client. And so we're not sure whether we need to transform the error. But sometimes we want to do that. So I think maybe there are some improvements that we could generally give to the GraphQL error specification, just generally, that might be able to better serve us. But also in general, I would just encourage to all the implementers everywhere to make sure that they're giving errors that that follow the spec as closely as possible, meaning that have paths in them. Because while I have everyone on this call, because that gives us problems when trying to stitch things.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question about this point. Like, you need to transform errors anyway, because you have like location and paths, and I'm not sure I understand what exactly is a problem here. Can you tell it more detail if you already mentioned it?
Oh yeah, sure. Sometimes we get errors from remote schemas where the implementers either of a gateway or of just a general GraphQL implementation, are kind of not actually. I don't have off the top of my head whether the path is a must or a should in the spec, but without that path, we're not sure exactly what caused the error. So we're not sure if a null. We can't be totally sure that a null on that field result is indeed a true null, so to speak, or a because of an error that corresponds with an error. So I think it's just generally helpful to give maximally all the recommended or the suggested fields in errors. And I think also improvements to the error sort of bundling. There was a topic that you raised at the working group I've been a long time ago that I thought was very appealing in terms of bundling or chaining errors. I think I have to look at it again. That might be helpful. So just that's just a general thing that I think we should be on the lookout for. Errors in particular could be fleshed out a little bit more, I think, in the spec. But generally speaking, this working group could prompt thoughts of how to improve, besides small building blocks about composition, which was my main theme. We could think of improvements or tightening the screws in terms of the main GraphQL spec that don't seem 100% related, but could be super helpful.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's a great example. Like standardizing error types, error formats, and especially in these distributed scenarios, I think that would be useful for everyone.
Just a small addition to that. Anytime you have multiple schemas being combined, it's entirely possible that one of your views of one of those schemas is out of date. So a pernicious example that I've run into is a field used to be non-nullable. Since the last time we looked at the schema, someone changed it, made it nullable. We're now executing a query that assumes it to be non-null, and we get back a null result, and what happens next? Right? From the client's perspective, they wrote a valid query against the valid view of the schema that they were served. From the service's perspective, its schema changed and it's now serving you a correct result. Who was in the wrong here? This is a tricky case. I don't think there's a very clear and obvious solution here, so I think it's worth considering while we're talking about making errors better all around.
That's a really interesting point, Predrag. One of the things that I would say is that the thing that's the final schema, the composite schema that's made out of all the other ones, should be a GraphQL schema. So externally, when you consume that schema, it should follow all of the rules in the spec. As such, if it exposes something that is null on a field that it says is non-null, it should throw an error. So what I'm basically saying is that it can't just do the most optimal, like, let's just patch all these bits of strings together and hope that the end result is fine. It must validate that, or at least it must be certain that the underlying services will not break its rules. If it doesn't do that, then it's not GraphQL compliant, right? It's broken its promise. So I think that's important. But as you say, where does the fault lie? I think the fault would lie in the subgraph for doing a breaking change. Also, I've just used the term subgraph, which I was trying to avoid using, but we did talk about what terminology we should use and what term. So we've talked about like a composite schema or a merged schema or like the final schema, et cetera, et cetera. I'm okay calling that just composite schema for now, after the name of the working group. But what do we want to call, like, what does everyone call the sub schemas at the moment?
Sub-schemas are fine.
Apollo's partial to subgraph, but
yeah, for federation specifically, we call them subgraphs. Yeah.
And do you feel ownership over that term subgraph? Like subgraph specifically means it implements these features, or do you just feel that that is a good name for a schema that is within a larger schema?
I think it's a good name for a schema that's in a larger schema, but specifically, I think it is about runtime composition or like federation. It's not necessarily about combining GraphQL files into one local schema. I wouldn't use it for that. But I'm not sure what other people think here.
So is anyone unhappy with the term sub-schemas to represent this concept in general? Just so we can get a term pinned down.
I'm fine with that.
Yep.
And just going back to the whole terminology thing, Uri was very careful earlier to not use the term, or to try not to use the term server, because these subschemas could be located in files, they could be located on remote servers, they could be, you know, any other way of accessing them. The GraphQL spec doesn't actually refer to the term server as well. I mean, it does in a couple of places, but broadly it doesn't. It uses the term service. So a GraphQL service does this, that, and the other. And a service doesn't even have to be like a server in the traditional way of thinking about it. Relay, for example, is a GraphQL service. Like it provides you GraphQL features within your client. So I wonder what a good term, or whether we need a term for that, and whether we need a term for the service that runs the composite schema. I think we can just talk of them in terms of the service that runs the sub-schema, the service that runs the composite schema. But does anyone feel that there's a nicer, neater, more concise way of expressing that?
I have a small reservation with respect to service that runs the composite schema, because at least in, for example, Kensha's use case, the composite schema is run from the consumer of the data, at least in, you know, that one situation. So that might not be a service, right? It might just be the browser.
I have a question. Maybe like it's partially related to what the question you raised, Benji. This subschema is valid schema, meaning it's have like a query type, it's have like fields on every type, or it can be like an unfinished schema, meaning no query type, like, and just set of types. So it's like a question if it's like should be finalized executable schema, or it can be like just set of types that don't validate as a full schema by GraphQL specification rules.
That is a great question, Ivan, and I'd like to open it up to the wider thing. My opinion is that a subschema is a fully executable schema, but does that fail to mesh with anyone's opinions on what we're doing here?
Well, I think we do run into, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I was thinking, like, let's say you have different subschemas, and then you have like one service that only cares about GraphQL subscriptions. So maybe those service wouldn't have a query root type at all, according to the GraphQL specification. That wouldn't be a legal service. So what people are doing today, they are adding a dummy query type to those things. And maybe it implies changes in the GraphQL specification to make a schema legal if it only has one of the 3 root types that are available today. But I think for me personally, a subschema means a schema that is executable on its own.
Yeah, I just want to, just backing up in terms of the question Benji asked a while ago, I think Ivan really hits the nail on the head, meaning schema composition sort of, what I think about it at build time, you know, can be composing non-valid schemas into one. But you know, what I like to, the holy grail, so to speak, you know, schemas that don't even know about each other, composing those will presumably be valid. And so it's tough, maybe, to think actually that if we can solve this problem by focusing only on remote schemas, and then solve the other case also, because there might be you know, ways in which they differ, even if they share common building blocks. So we might want to think about formally saying we'll tackle one first, or in 2 different tracks, or only one. But I don't think we should limit ourselves to, and that does create a problem for nomenclature.
Quick question. Sorry if this betrays my naivete about broader GraphQL. If you had non-complete schemas that are not executable on their own and you wanted to combine them together, does it introduce an issue if you say introduced a root type, you know, query type that is, you know, essentially a no-op, right? It has no fields. There's nothing that you can query, assuming that you could parse this and that the standard allowed it. Composing those seems like it produces the same no-op, you know, root type. And so is there an issue in that respect if these subschemas that are not individually executable just declare it a type that kind of is honest about that and says we're not individually executable?
I think the way all the implementations are done today that do some kind of schema composition is that they use query root fields for actually merging together all those resources. So not having a query type kind of could defeat the purpose, because like if you have different resources, you actually need those query root types to have like an entry point into the graph. And if you're looking at subscription and mutations, those are easier to merge, I would say, if you're naive and just looking at the root fields on the query and the mutation and the subscriptions. Those are easily mergeable. But like in order to merge entities together, you actually need those entry points.
I guess I was just assuming that those entry points would be added in one of the other schemas that is being merged together. But I'm happy to take this offline, not hug the mic.
I mean, I think it's a valid question, because like with Federation, you have this entry point. It's like a entity's entry point that exists on every subgraph, but it's kind of an implementation detail. So it's usually not thought of as something that's part of this subgraph, and it's also an implementation detail that in that it could change client consumers don't ever see it, and it's it's just kind of this part of the runtime contract, I guess, or the execution contract. And so in that sense, it is valid to have a sub schema maybe that's just defining an entity or a type.
My thought is that even though I agree, first of all, I think it's a really good question. Second of all, I think that even though I would agree to start with the sentiment of like maybe starting with figuring out a standard around solving merging or composition of valid schemas, I wouldn't necessarily lock it for the other solution. Maybe later on we could also tackle that. So maybe in terms of naming, I wouldn't necessarily say it only means a valid schema, because maybe we would want to tackle it, I don't know, in the future.
I think it might be important to know the difference, though. So, I think having a different term or a different flavor of that term for one that isn't a fully valid schema is important. And the other thing that I think, it's really interesting. I think we've come up with many, many different use cases here. I think it would be good to really go back to those use cases when we come up with the terminology in the context of those use cases. Because, in the case where the sub schema does not know it's being merged, I think that there's that's a very valid use case. I think there's also valid use cases where the sub schema does know it's being consumed, and it can define, because it's being consumed by multiple merge schemas, right? And so then it might want to expose only those pieces that it wants to be merged, or it adds semantic information to the sub schema that the sub schema can then be more performant because it knows how it's being consumed elsewhere. And so I do think there's a couple different permutations of these use cases that would be really interesting to sort of zone in on and get agreement on, and then turn around and try to put some of the suggested terminology in that context, and see whether we need to differentiate. I also think, we talked about before where the sub schema may change something that the super schema or the composite schema, trying to find the right terminology here, composite schema, is there some, it starts to trigger in my mind some sort of contract, that if you are, maybe, and that would be the case where it's known. So at the time you consume, maybe you let the sub schema know, hey, I've just consumed you. And then, back in the, in my olden days, this is a metadata server that knows, how things are changed. So if you change something, what you affect, where you've been consumed. And maybe that's just a simple, I've consumed you kind of thing. And so if I change something, I push that notification out. I don't know. So those are some thoughts I've been accumulating as we've been talking.
Go ahead, Jens.
Yeah, I just had something pop into my head. It's related actually to an issue caused by you, Benji. So as I said earlier, we compose and combine different schemas, or try to do that automatically from different services. And one of our users was using Graphql, and Graphql, he was using the relay spec. So their schema implemented this node interface. And what should actually happen if one schema has this interface on the query type, and you compose it with another schema that doesn't have this interface? If you create a composed query type, that would actually be broken. So that was actually an issue. And yeah, I don't know, maybe someone has an idea what we can do about this. Maybe Benji, you caused this problem. No, okay.
Yeah, so it's actually, we do add the node interface on the query type, but you can just skip that as a plugin. But The idea of these shared interfaces is actually a really important thing, I think, when it comes to composition. So Uri's mentioned a few times about having some kind of rules-based system. And I would really like for us to expand on what those rules could be. I am very aware that we've only got about 25 minutes left. But I know obviously there's rules such as like add this field to this type, which are quite straightforward, but there are these more complex rules like, oh, this interface is equivalent to this interface. And I think another thing that we should keep in mind when thinking about those things is just because they're called the same thing and have the same fields right now doesn't mean that they necessarily are the same thing. And that the two schemas might build them in a divergent fashion. And so actually stating that they are the same thing is something that would be beneficial. Was it Hugh? Was it you I cut off just then? I think I cut someone off. Please, whoever it was, please speak.
+1 to everything you just said. It was me. This is one of the reasons why I'm a fan of having the rules for the composition defined as much as possible outside of the schemas being merged, and not mandating that schemas know they're being merged. Because then if these rules are outside, you hopefully know what you're targeting and whether you want the node query type or the relay compatible version or the non-relay compatible version, and can make a good decision with that. From inside the schemas, it's impossible to know, and it's kind of bold to presume to even try to know how people are going to end up using this in the first place, especially for APIs that are sort of exposed to the broader public. For example, I'd be very sad if GraphQL forced me to use their schema in a particular way. So that's my 2 cents on the issue. So I broadly agree with what you just said.
If I can be so bold as to draw a bit of a conclusion for what we've been saying here, and that is we do have this problem of schemas that know about being stitched together or being merged together and schemas that don't. If we were to solve that with some external metadata, then it solves both problems. And we can still put metadata into the schemas that do know and just have that generate out to be this external metadata or something like that. There are, however, there is definitely a difference between data and code. And I do wonder whether we actually need code for any of this, or whether actually just data alone is sufficient for all use cases. I'd love to expand into that. We have about 20 minutes left. So if there's any topics that someone's been itching to raise, now would be a good time to raise it. Or if you can't raise it, point it into the chat and we'll see if we can squeeze it in.
Benji, this might be a good time to just jump in with a bit of logistics. Is there a plan to enable discussions on the Composite Schemas working group repo?
I will do that.
Oh, okay, awesome. Because it might be a lot of the stuff we've talked about are great topics today. It might be great to just start individual discussions about those things in GitHub, carry the conversation forward.
Another logistical question. I spoke to a few people in the chat, and there seemed like there might be some interest for a social hour, either as at the end of this meeting or at the end of a future meeting, just to get to know everyone. I think there are a lot of really cool people here. So just putting that out there for people's consideration, and if there's interest, maybe we can put something together.
Thanks, Benji. That was fast.
Okay, well, otherwise, there have been a few things that have been raised in the text chat that I'm not sure were reflected in the voice chat. one of which is someone from the guild, I don't remember who, forgive me, shared that they have a distributed GraphQL glossary document that they've been working on. Would someone from the guild like to give us more information about that now, please?
Yeah, so basically I started this when we did some research into all the possible things out there, and we quickly realized that everyone is like using different terminology. And so I'm happy we already like defined some words today, and I'm happy to like keep this updated and then add all possible solutions on there and their solution-based jargon or whatever you would call it. And then basically we would have like one document that you can look at and understand what each term means, because right now it's very hard to figure out what is actually what and in which context, what solutions are available and which ones work together and which ones do not work together. Yeah, that's basically the idea behind this document.
One question about the document, which we might be able to apply to this as well, is how did you kind of start building up? Like, kind of where did you start from, and sort of what were your sort of aims in sort of building it up?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
So in terms of like sort of building up the glossary and that sort of thing, like, so where did you start from, and kind of sort of
so where did I get those terms from?
It is kind of like what did you initially aim to do, and kind of what was your starting point, and sort of how did you sort of expand from there, basically?
So I personally started like in the terms of understanding what solutions are available and learning how they work. And quickly I realized the most prominent ones are the schema stitching from GraphQL Tools, which is a JavaScript library that we also maintain. And the other one is Apollo Federation. I'm biased around the JavaScript ecosystem, so I'm not aware of solutions in other languages or whatever that much. But in terms of this, it was like, even for us internally, when we talked about schema stitching or federation, everyone had like different terms for everything. And that was my main motivation for actually starting this document. So when we talk about something, we actually know we're meaning the same thing and we're not kind of like talking like this. So right now it's actually a Notion document, but I'm open for like converting it into a Markdown file that we can also put in a GitHub repository, and then everyone can actually contribute to it. So yeah, we can maybe start a discussions or something like this, and then move on from there and see what's best.
All right, fantastic. So what I'd like to do in the last 15 minutes or so is figure out which things we actually should be talking about asynchronously, try and bring them into some topics. One thing, so I've already made a start on this. There is the definitions, which we would all like to have shared definitions, and we've just been talking about that. So I'd love to see someone open a discussion, maybe someone from the guild open a discussion, link in your document, and we can discuss it below there. Another thing is the rules approach that was suggested. Like, I actually want to know, or I think we all need to know, what the different rules are that these the schemas metadata or the external metadata, no matter how it's done, needs to know. Like, this field is being located in this type, or this interface is the same as this other interface, and so on and so forth. That would be beneficial. We also had Roman talking about the modularization of very large schemas that you can't represent in memory, or it's very hard to do so, such as Facebook schema, which we've heard takes about a minute to load into Graphql. I don't think that's a topic for this working group. However, I do think that many of the people at this working group are affected by this issue. So I do think it's a significant issue. And I'd recommend that we then talk about that issue, maybe on a discussion on the main GraphQL working group repository for now. Roman, if you'd be able to raising that as a discussion on there would be very good. And then anyone who's interested can add themselves there. What other main discussions do people feel, based on the conversations that we've had today, should we be raising and discussing before the next meeting?
I think documenting the use cases.
I think I'm personally interested in scalability issues. Right now, like we heard basically two examples. One is like name conflicts, and people want name spacing for that. And second is like size of resulting schema after composition. Maybe somebody hit other like scalability problems. So it would be great to hear, because different people have different use cases, and so, as we learn, like it's possible to hit hundreds of megabytes of schema, maybe like other scalability limitation.
I have a quick. Sorry, go on, Hugh. Go on. Hugh.
No, sorry. Go ahead, Benji. Sorry.
I was just going to add to what Ivan said. I know that a lot of people who I don't think have managed to make it here today did mention that name spacing seems like something that would be important for the Composite Schemas working group. I personally am not in favor of it at this stage, but I definitely think it's a conversation worth having. And it may well also tie into the modularity that Roman raised earlier. So Ivan, if you can raise those two discussions you just mentioned, the name spacing and dealing with the size of large schemas, that would be great. Sorry, Hugh.
That's okay. Yeah, no, my question was just, this is a little bit of a carryover from last week's GraphQL working group meeting. Will this meeting be the place, or the discussions for this repo be the place that will carry the conversation about metadata over introspection, introspection versus SDL, all that fun stuff that's very important for composite schemas? Are those discussions intended to happen here?
No, those are not part of this subgroup. I think this subgroup definitely will benefit from those topics. I mean, metadata here is basically a lot of what we've been talking about is describing these things. So that is entirely metadata. Whether that be in schema or out of schema is something that we care about at this working group. But what it ultimately ends up going in the spec is a discussion for the spec working group, the main working group at the moment. Okay. We have actually discussed, and I think Ivan may even have been tasked with setting up separate asynchronous discussions for this.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, I definitely think there's 100% overlap there, but this is not the owner of that topic.
Great. Okay. Thanks for clarifying.
Clarification. I created discussion because I assume people in this call will be interested. So I shared the link in the chat. Feel free to join there. And I also suggest a date for a separate call about custom metadata and how we should, what mechanisms we should use for them. One clarification about previous points. Like my suggestion for discussion, and I can file it, wasn't like with two particular topics. It was example. I was asking maybe have a discussion on if people have other limitation beyond like name clashes or schema sets. Maybe somebody hit something else, and that we're all interested in hearing. Meaning like scalability limitation. The more schemas you join and you hit like this limit. So I will file one about schema size, and I will also open one about scalability.
My 2 cents are that those two are very likely going to end up related. As we grow the size of the schemas, the federation, the scalability issues tend to come up. Even if your query and your result are small, just type checking that the query is valid against this large schema can run into scalability issues. So I'd be interested in having it be a single discussion, but that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, probably. I think you're right. Having one big discussion and split it off if it's tend to center around separate topics. Yeah. So one big.
Ivan, I have a question maybe related to this regarding errors. If you compose a schema and you have the sub schemas and errors happen in the sub schemas, what kind of errors and paths should you actually return to the client? Like, does the client depend on the composite schema? Should it get those errors? But the paths from an error can be completely different between the composed schema and the sub schema. So what is the right way to return errors in a composed schema to the client?
I think spec answer what question. It said like where error, like where you put in now, this thing should be in a path. So as we discussed, our holy grail is to have like the fact that schema is composable to be in implementation detail. So for client, it's like just normal GraphQL schema. So you should transform all the errors and remap not only paths, but there is locations. So if you send another query to subschema, you need to remap locations also. And so
I don't quite understand what composed schemas have to do with the error paths are paths in the query, right? Not in type system. If you have a query with nested fields and so on, right, and one of the fields blows up, then the error reported, it has path which follows the query itself. And I don't think it has anything to do with the type system, schema, or how it was composed, right?
Yeah. We have like, I think we have 6 minutes till the end, so we need to do organizational one. Just a super quick answer, like when you send one big query and you need to distribute it to subgraphs, subschemas. So you split it into smaller one, and when you compose the result. But we can talk about this asynchronously and keep like this discussion.
Okay, got it.
Yakov and Predrag, you both talked about composability and also things like what do we need to do to make sure that composability isn't broken, rules of composability, that kind of thing. Would one of you be willing to raise a discussion to get the ball rolling on that topic?
Sure. Happy to do it. Happy to work together.
Yeah. Fantastic. And another thing that keeps coming up and was just discussed again was errors. So would someone like to take control of the errors topic and raise a discussion on that?
I can take that one, actually.
Yeah.
Or or Ivan can, because he's done some work on it.
No, I actually wanted to suggest you taking it because you have like actual experience of that. So you know, like because you work with it in stitching and you see like implementation and stuff, especially since you done runtime stitching and not like schema based. So I think you have more issues with errors. So yeah, I think you're the right person.
Okay, I'll give it a go.
All right. Is there anything else before we close out the meeting?
This is really great, Benji. Thanks for organizing this.
And for being a very effective moderator.
Yeah, it's been fantastic.
All right, thank you, everyone. I will organize another meeting for roughly a month's time. Please do get involved in the discussions. The notes will go up shortly after the meeting. I will take care of doing that myself. The YouTube video for anyone who wants to watch this will be available at some point. I normally do it once a month. If someone needs that more urgently for someone who couldn't attend or something like that, let me know and I'll do that sooner. Otherwise, thank you very much. This has been excellent conversations. I think we've made a lot of progress. We've got a better understanding of the problem space now, I think, as well. So thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you all next month.
Awesome. Thanks all.
Thanks,
Thanks, Benji.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
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 To Charlie, because he just said he was going to do at least some documentation, not end user documentation, clarity documentation.
No, I'm going to do a www ticket. So